As always, there will be spoilers. If you have not listened to or read Psychosis yet, link is in the description for both forms. The story begins with our protagonist, John, writing in a notebook about noticing strange things going on lately. He feels that writing it down on paper is more secure than on his computer. He soon decides to try and call a friend of his, Amy. Before he can, though, he receives a call from a wrong number. After brushing it off, he gets a call from another unknown number. However, after picking up, Amy's voice comes through, explaining that she's at a party and that her phone died. After this conversation, John is able to calm himself down from his mild paranoia he's been working himself into. That is, until he believes there was something strange about the call. That being, he heard no wind on Amy's end of the call, despite her being at a party. He leaves to check if the wind was still blowing outside of his building. He updates his journal the next day, claiming that nothing was out of the ordinary and that he plans to clean himself up and get out of the house for a bit. That is, until he hears a sound which he comes to find out is thunder. Despite his plans of going outside being halted, John takes the time to go up to the third floor of his complex to look out a large window, attempting to see another person. He then thinks about opening the window, but is reluctant to do so, ultimately letting his rising paranoia to take hold again. After returning to his basement apartment, John gets on video call with a friend for a few minutes. However, he notes that during the call, there wasn't much to it. Nothing they talked about was of any real note. John then gets a text from Amy asking him to go out to eat with her, which he initially accepts. However, just before he leaves, he receives an email from a friend that says, "Seen with your own eyes, don't trust them, they." This once again spikes his paranoia, causing him to remain in his apartment. John begins to spiral out of control, questioning what the message could mean. He thinks back to the past few days and how he hasn't had real contact with another person in all that time, nor has he actually seen anyone. John then realizes that whoever or whatever this force is working against him, that he only gets contact from the outside whenever he makes the first move, and that they possibly know where he lives after telling Amy how far away he was from their party. John attempts to calm himself down, but his paranoia gets the best of him once again, and in a fit of terror, he tries to get a signal on his phone so that he can text everyone he knows with, "Seen anyone face to face lately?" then taping his phone to his bathroom ceiling once he was able to get a bar of signal. The next day, John receives a call from Amy, telling him that she's coming over. Rather than cleaning up his now trashed apartment, nor making himself look any better, John decides he wants Amy to see what he's been through. After she knocks on the door, John has her speak to a camera he placed down the hallway from his room, previously in the story. She complies, and John asks her to tell him anything about them that only the two of them would know about, just to prove that she is who she says she is. Amy tells him about how they first met at a playground years ago, noting they were both way too old to be there in the first place. At first, John is relieved that it really is Amy outside, knowing that no one else would know about that memory but the two of them. Just before he opens the door, however, he realizes that a second webcam he had connected to his computer was able to see his journal, which he had written about that exact memory of the two of them. Realizing that Amy had used that same memory as well to prove herself out of any other piece of knowledge she could have used, John now believes that whatever force is trying to get to him was pretending to be Amy outside the door. Now terrified, John begins to scream for help, the door shaking and attempting to be opened. He notes that he couldn't hear her voice through the door, whether it was because it was too thick or because it wasn't actually her out there. He didn't know. For the next 3 days, John has himself barricaded in his apartment, his paranoia now at an all-time high. He still attempts to rationalize everything, to convince himself that everything he's experienced up till now was just the result of coincidence. He gets another knock on the door, this time from a psychiatrist and 2 police officers. The psychiatrist explains that there's been an epidemic of sorts, a mental virus, one triggering paranoia in many who received a message, making them believe there was some cabal working against them. John tells himself that he has every reason to believe this, that this explains the strange email he got, and that the lack of contact he's had was all from extreme probability. However, his paranoia takes hold, making him question the convenience of this explanation. As the 2 officers begin bashing at the door, John resolves himself to the idea that he was now going to see what this cabal is. Before they're able to get in, though, he begins to ask himself if this force acting against him can deceive his eyes or not, realizing that both cameras and the human eye receive information through electrical signals. He then presumably damages his eyes into permanent blindness. Our last journal entry comes to us from inside a mental ward, John writing one last message before he forgets how to properly write, now being blind. He believes that whatever this enigmatic force is, that it's possibly taken over the world. He explains that it also used to come to him, masquerading as Amy, eventually no longer using that trick. John believes that Amy could still be alive, possibly kept that way by his will to defy this force. The story cuts away to the perspective of the doctor overseeing John, who reads his message. The doctor is amused by John's will to be defiant, but also know that he is completely insane, noting that any sane man would have fallen for the deception long ago. The doctor, controlled by this shadowy force, comes to John, telling him that he is delusional, that no one is trying to deceive him. Now for speculation, concepts, and symbolism within the story, at least the way I see them. To start, when I first read this story about 4 to 5 years ago, it left me messed up for about 3 days. That twist ending made me think about the rest of the story all day, for several days, going back over the details and realizing how it fell in line with the idea that there really was something taking over the world. So the obvious first bit of speculation: what is the cabal or entity that's taking over everyone? Of course, the story doesn't tell us, but I do have a few theories. To start, aliens. Why not? Given that it's explained that the doctor has nerve filaments wrapped around his head, or I assume brain, that's plugged into his eyes, one can assume this is advanced technology being employed by an alien force. The next possibility is a technological dystopian takeover. The shadow elites are finally deploying their tyrannical control over society, deploying neurological devices that can control those who fall into their rule. Both of these theories don't explain how life seemingly is continuing like normal for those who have fallen for the deception, unless either of these forces are deliberately keeping life going as normal. John notes that in the asylum, he overhears a nurse talking about having a baby and a doctor who lost their wife in a car accident. He believes this to be the entity trying to trick him into thinking everything is normal and that he is in fact crazy. If life is really continuing on as normal, it's not as likely that aliens or some tyrannical dictatorship has taken over the world. Or it really is a deception and the world as we know it has ended in this story. My last theory about this is something I think is far more plausible, but it's also more metaphorical in nature. There is a deception going on, but it's one of subtle control. Rather than a shadowy cabal taking over, it could be a metaphor of everyday life being relegated to technology. Us letting screens take over our lives more and more by our own will. The supposed nerve filaments wrapped around the doctor's head or brain could be another way of saying mental programming, the kind that comes about from propaganda and routine. The doctor feels that too many people are subject to the technology as well and are letting it take more control over their lives. However, to say this would be to betray the routine the masses have become complacent in. He doesn't encourage John's defiance because he's too used to the status quo. I think this theory holds some ground, as John uses physical paper and pen to document his thoughts and feelings about what's going on, and anytime technology comes into play, it betrays his sense of reality. Another note that I think supports this theory: while on the 3rd floor, lightning causes flashes of light to streak across the apartment doors, and for a brief moment, John sees them as large monoliths made of stone. This imagery comes back to him after Amy, or whatever was mimicking her, attempts to open the door and is unable to. The idea that doors have been symbols of guardians or portals comes to his mind. It's possible that John's apartment door is a metaphor to the idea that it's guarding him from the outside world, which is becoming less and less human and more focused on technology. John's paranoia is also described as Cyberpsychosis by the psychiatrist, which is happening to many in the story due to more and more human interaction becoming simulated. This description here, I think, gives more credence to my theory than anything else. The whole story itself could be an abridged version of the last several decades of exponential technology growth and spread. Does this explain everything? Not perfectly, but with a few small leaps, I think it gets the idea where it needs to go. Some of the personal interactions John has that are less metaphor and more direct mysteries, I think are used to lend themselves to this being a personalized story, anthropomorphizing technology and its effect on human interaction. Now, this theory of mine isn't to be preachy about our technological society, and I am not telling you to smash your phone and take a magnet to your hard drives. It's a theory to explain what the story might be about. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences are for you to decide the morality of. There are some story execution elements I wanted to touch on. In my review for Mr. Widemouth, I said to reduce plausible deniability the further you get in. This way you aren't as hung up on trying to ground the story in reality, and are able to tell the story that needs to be told. In a story like Psychosis that tries to maintain that it's in normal reality, maintaining plausible deniability helps it dig into you. It wants you to be as skeptical as the main character. Mr. Widemouth is a story about a child's interaction with a strange creature. Psychosis is about a man who's losing his grip on reality, desperately trying to keep himself convinced that he's worked up over nothing. Obviously, it heavily depends on the plot of the story. A creature tale and a psychological thriller, very different in execution. Psychosis also has a larger implication, that possibly the whole world is being taken over. So you, the reader, want it to be all a paranoid fear with no actual truth to it, much the same as the main character. Mr. Widemouth has a very small scale to it, so even if the creature is real in the story's universe, it doesn't affect too many people. It's like in a disaster movie where you hope that everything will turn out better in the end, or, plot permitting, it's all just a dream and millions of people aren't actually dead. As always, let's boil this down to its base elements. Plot: psychological thriller, where the main character is paranoid about the world around them, but is also doubtful of their own fears. Ultimately, their delusions get the best of them, and it all culminating in a twist that confirms that the main character isn't actually crazy, but we wish they were. Characters: one central character that is used to their fullest, one that we want to see come back to a sense of normality, but ultimately loses to the throes of insanity. One side character that seems to be a lifeline back to the world of the sane, but is somewhat turned against us. Themes: technology versus traditionalism. Slightly, very slightly. The human condition, the effects of prolonged separation, and the need to spite authority.